bit of a tricky task maybe for me to introduce it, but I hope to add one or two things that might help you appreciate the film. So I think I want to start by talking about the origin of the footage, because one finds this footage from this film from 2005. As you'll see, it comprises only footage taken during the war, or immediately, possibly a tiny bit immediately after it. And so this footage goes back to the siege of Leningrad. So after the siege began on the 7th of September 1941, the project of making a film about life under the siege dates to October that year. And so one has to picture, I mean, I realize many of you know a great deal about all of this, possibly more than me, but indulge me for a moment for those who aren't familiar with the context of the siege of Leningrad, in which, you know, between maybe 500,000 to 1 million civilians died, you know, in the 900 days of it. And the winter of 41 to 42 is, of course, the absolute worst point of it. So one has to picture then these filmmakers on hunger rations, having to travel on foot to film, as the public transport ground to a halt by the beginning of December. They were, of course, what they were expected to do initially was to make footage for newsreels that would be released both locally and centrally from Moscow, to make footage that could be developed for the sort of national Soviet, if you want, propaganda message. But very soon they lacked even the facilities and resources to develop the footage that they continued to film. But they still continued to film it. But what's more, the process continued so that the studio's central control over what they were filming weakened. So again, you have to imagine the context of Soviet cinema during World War II, where filmmakers were given specific tasks as to what kind of things they ought to be filmed, and then this footage was developed and then shown in a screening room in the studio, and the cameramen were kind of marked, and their footage was evaluated by the studio officials, and if it wasn't the right kind of thing, then it was thrown out. And very often the cameramen were told to, they were sort of redeployed, let's say. And this kind of thing, this kind of strict control really broke down in the context of Leningrad during the blockade. So the cameramen effectively started to take this project to show some initiative, if you want, a kind of independent initiative, and to film the kinds of things that they thought were important, that they saw developing in front of them. So they began to accumulate hours of footage which recorded the plight of the city, the emaciated citizens dragging sledges, one famous image of someone apparently dying right in front of the cameraman, just near to Nevsky Prospect. And we see people dragging water, fuel, in some cases corpses. Some of these images are, of course, familiar, and I will come back to that familiarity in just a second. So, in terms of the film, at the end of December, the city authorities, the Obkom, were shown a number of the footage, and they agreed to redeploy resources to enable the film to be finished. So by February 1942, all of the footage that had been taken since October was developed, and oh yeah, I should have some slides. So this is Yefim Kuchitil, one of the primary cameramen, his name may be familiar to some of you because his son Alexei Kuchitil is, of course, a prominent filmmaker in St. Petersburg, living today. So these people, the primary cameramen, they started to try and look for a way of structuring all this material. Of course, I should add, all of this is silent film footage. In this context, during World War II, of course, there were sound recording facilities, but they were in the Soviet context they were fairly rare. This meant that, you know, and certainly in Leningrad there was none. There were no working sound recording, mobile sound recording facilities. Obviously there was the radio studio, but so that, you know, these cameramen were going around effectively with silent cameras, and in general that was the kind of the context of World War II documentary films. So they had to try and find a way of structuring this footage, and they invited a Leningrad-based writer, Sergei Vyshinsky, famous for his dramas essentially, and I won't go into who and what he was in too much detail, but suffice it to say that he made a very sort of brave effort, a protracted and intense effort to find a way of structuring this footage to make a film. So in March he was sat in a unheated viewing projection facility in Obvodny Canal, and, you know, watching a whole number of, you know, thousands of meters of this footage, and he came up with a voiceover commentary within weeks. But the voiceover commentary that he came up with was one that really stressed the sort of thing that comes across from this footage more than anything else, and that's the sort of the tragedy and the suffering of what we see there. And it stresses the separate fate of Leningrad, the way in which Leningrad is somehow cut off from the more general Soviet experience. And finally, it's narrated by someone with someone who's lived through it. So it's an insider's perspective about the blockade. This is a film that, you know, that we only have the sort of drafts for it because this message was unacceptable, and a film, according to that script, was never completed. So, so what happened essentially then is that someone was brought in from Moscow. I mean, I won't. I'll come back to some of the characteristics of this footage, but I think, you know, they're going to be quite clear in just a minute. I suppose I should say that Soviet footage of World War II, it's sort of recently been accepted that they were willing to show atrocities, Nazi atrocities, to an extent that was unthinkable in the British context, say. Obviously, you know, the context of Britain in 1941 and 42 is quite different. There's no occupation for a start, right? But even if we think in the British context of 1940, filming the Blitz, many people will be familiar with footage from films alternatively titled London Can Take It or Britain Can Take It. And the emphasis is very much upon stoicism, and there's no real attempt to show the sort of body count and the sort of depth of the numbers of people killed. The Soviet footage, starting from approximately the footage of the Battle of Moscow, did start to show Nazi atrocities, but it only started to show them when they had a victorious ending to sort of complete the film with, right? So, you know, they could show civilians who'd been hanged, prisoners of war, the corpses of prisoners of war who'd been butchered by the occupiers, the German occupiers, but they could show that because they could end the film with a sense that the Soviets are advancing and victory is at hand, and the Soviets have the means of vengeance against the Germans in their hands. The Leningrad footage, essentially one of its problems is it can't do that. So it shows all of this horrible stuff, all this depths of suffering, but it has no sense of victory with which to counterbalance that. It's really just recording the depths of the human tragedy. And so the footage itself, as I'll argue, relates very much to what Sergei Loznitsa tries to do with it in this film of 2005. So what happens in 1942, however, is that this guy's version of the film is spiked. He's not allowed to complete it. And a very famous figure Roman Carmen is sent from Moscow on the Road of Life, the famous Road of Life. Supposedly, I mean, his accounts, one has to read them very much with, a grain of salt. He supposedly, during the fourth movement of the Moscow premiere of Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, the truck arrived to take him over the Road of Life in March 1942 to Leningrad. But the timing is not the issue, though. So his task, of course, is to make a film from this footage that's acceptable to Moscow. And this is from his memoirs. So we had a talk about the matter in hand. I informed the comrades about the worries the Committee for Cinematography, that's Moscow, has about the position of the, or had maybe, about the position of the Leningrad newsreel cameraman, and decided to make a feature film. They decided not to, sorry, there's a not missing there, they decided not to send material for newsreel. So they stopped sending newsreel. They were trying to make this film purely about Leningrad. And they accepted that. They said, we really have been accumulating material for a feature film about defense of Leningrad. We could have sent some stuff to Moscow, of course. We could have sent more and more regularly, but they had problems with the laboratory. And the other thing is they were absolutely petrified that they might lose the original film. This is sort of a very valuable record that they were creating, and they didn't want to run that risk. But Carmen sees, as it were, the bigger picture, and that's the international propaganda dimension. And that's, we need constant information. The Central Editorial Office of News was inundated with requests from countries around the world. Show us Leningrad and the siege. To keep the material you've accumulated in a safe is an enormous mistake. Let's get together and try to think how to get out of the situation. Of course, this collaborative effort was obviously going to be very much on Carmen's terms. He was the guy sent from Moscow to produce the correct narrative, and the correct narrative then meant showing showing Zhukov, showing leaders, showing the important role of the party, the obkom, showing Zhdanov and so forth. It also meant moving away from the sort of civilian experience. It meant obviously it meant showing the bread ration. So you do have this, but you have this more uplifting sense of the civilian experience. People in the public library, these are much more famous images. I imagine many of you, any of you see any documentary of Leningrad, you would be familiar with these. The World at War, the famous Unknown War, the Soviet film from a series from the 1970s, and so forth. So this is someone reading in the public library, but the images of the Road of Life. I'll come back to this. You do see some of these awful images of the civilian suffering, but as we'll see in Sergei Loznitsa's film, this is cropped from an image that shows you a much greater extent of dead, particularly of infants who've died in the siege. We see images. We see German images in Leningrad in Carmen's film. Leningrad Barbier, so Leningrad struggle fights on, or something like that is the way it might be translated. So we see German footage of Loznitsa's film has none of this, and nor did the original Soviet film or this footage, obviously. But on the other hand, we see the air defences shooting down some of those planes, and it kind of ends with a sense of the life kind of returning to normal as the trams run again in spring 1942. So the original footage, and as we'll see, Loznitsa's treatment of it doesn't have many of these famous, doesn't stress some of these famous images that you're familiar with. It doesn't create this optimistic narrative of struggle and of life returning to normal. I don't want to go on for too much longer, but So let's move on to Sergei Loznitsa. So one of the key things then, as his statement here puts it, is the fact that we have no voiceover in this film. This is an aesthetic decision, but it's also a kind of sense that he wants to allow people to make up their own minds about the footage, about what they see. So, so I could add some of the things we won't see in this film that we would see if we've seen things like The World at War and other documentaries that use some of the Leningrad footage. We'd have maps, we'd have explanations of the sense, that the importance of Leningrad in the wider picture of the war. None of that do we get in this film. So this film is very widely acclaimed, The Siege and Blockade, very widely acclaimed in a number of film festivals. But it doesn't just get rid of or avoid, eschew the voice over. We don't have any dialogue, we don't have any interviews, and no testimony. So what he's done is he's gone back to that footage from World War II, created by the Leningrad cameraman, and he's added, as we'll see, sounds create sounds created in the studio that attempt to sort of bring out what's going on in front of us in those images. So obviously there's an attempt to get away from a kind of the traditional or the accepted narrative, or in fact from any narrative. So he doesn't just avoid a Soviet narrative, he avoids the kind of narrative we might have had in a British or American documentary about the siege of Leningrad. We're left entirely to our own devices, one could argue. I mean, I'll come back to that in just a minute. But what the footage is, very often he's allowed. We see that the original cameraman had sort of taken a long, sort of a shot of maybe a minute's duration or 30 seconds duration, and we might be familiar with a tiny sliver of that image, but he's tried wherever possible to give us this sort of durational sense of the whole of a given footage, piece of footage, a given shot. So the idea then is, as I say, to very much try to sort of get away from the notion of a kind of the use of the footage to instrumentalize a certain kind of reading, to get away from a sort of ideological account maybe, to get away from the sort of redemptive sense that this is all a kind of meaningful sacrifice, that it's heroic resistance, that it's epic. These are the sorts of ways in which we might be used to sort of framing our understanding and thinking about the siege of Leningrad and the images of the siege of Leningrad. And what Loznitsa does is entirely different. I could add, so what we have is sound effects. We have inaudible voices. The sound effects are sort of calculated to bring out different levels of what we see in front of us. Sort of sounds of the trams in the background, sounds of sort of mechanical noises, a screeching of machinery, footsteps, rumble of crowds, sounds of masonry falling. All of these, so we're concentrating on the actual sounds of what we see in Leningrad. And from, I said, there are people who know some of this material a lot better than I do, but a number of the diaries and memoir accounts do stress the sort of silence and the particularly eerie quality of what of the sort of aural scape of the siege. So the idea, of course, is to refocus us on some kind of everyday experience. One might talk about that in terms of memory, or just some kind of everyday life of what's happening, rather than the historical plot. So the effect also is to encourage us to connect with the emotional dimension of what's going on, and I think that one of the curiously, all those voiceovers, they can be very emotive, but the removal of them and the sort of sense of the footsteps in the snow being emphasized, for example, by Sergei Loznitsa's film, that has an emotional power of its own. I think you'll agree when you look at the film, if you haven't seen it already. A physicality. I think we could go on and we could sort of place it with regard to other filmmaking. I know one would conceivably, it seems possibly out of place, but it's it is not unrelated to the filmmaking of someone like Tarkovsky or Sakurov, who stressed the sort of sense of, or German, Alexei German, who stressed, either father or son, who stressed the sense of time passing. But I think I've probably talked enough. So I hope. So just I have a couple more slides though. And this is again from Loznitsa's Moscow Times interview. So he does talk about the sort of there's a narrative to this film which is not which is the opposite of a redemptive one. And obviously one of the things that he's talking about ultimately, or is trying to get to, to move towards with his use of film, is a sense that this is an unverbalizable experience. And of course, just as with the Holocaust, there's a sort of question of, can it be represented, can it be verbalized? And we do see, that is something you will also see with regard to the siege of Leningrad. So he's trying to represent it, but this is a famous sense from the eyewitnesses that this is something that really cannot be discussed, cannot be described, but nevertheless one has to attempt to do that, and I think that Sergei Loznitsa's attempt to describe, to rethink, redescribe the siege is worthwhile, and so we can hopefully your thoughts and reflections will be